Hello and welcome into another PM Tricks session. This time we'll talk about something I'd like to call stakeholder shenanigans. And by that I mean managing stakeholders, their expectations, and dealing with organizational politics while doing so. So the stakeholders are the key part of any project. You cannot have a project in a vacuum. There are always multiple sides to any projects from people perspective, from stakeholder perspective. And anybody with interest or investment in the project is considered a stakeholder. So managing stakeholders, their expectations, dealing with company policies and politics is a daily job of project manager. And knowing how to do so is an important business skill. The bigger the project, the bigger part of the project interactions has to do with politics and stakeholder management. If you don't manage stakeholder expectations throughout the whole project lifecycle, you might face project failure. So managing stakeholders is something we start with and we'll finish with in this session. And basically, there are several steps you can do. However, you must keep in mind that many things dealing with human skills, working with people, you cannot learn from the books. The books can guide you, for sure. They cannot help you gain experience. Therefore, you need to practice. You need to learn things, apply them in your work and life, and discard something that doesn't work for you, and continue using what does work for you. So books cannot answer all your questions. Only you, by continuous implementation of your skills and developing those skills, only you can make yourself a successful project manager, and in particular people manager, specifically dealing with stakeholders. First step in any project is identification of stakeholders. Once you have project request coming, you're already dealing with stakeholders, and you do so. You do identification and management of stakeholders as early as possible in the project lifecycle, and you do so throughout the whole project lifecycle until the very closure of the project. And successful identification and management of stakeholders can mean the life of the project, basically difference between success and failure. You can differentiate stakeholders by various means. In particular, you can use some formal approaches in identifying the project, the stakeholders in the project. But first step is to use certain basic skills. Even though overall literature cannot help you in managing projects on a difficult scale, basic skills can help you and guide you in dealing with the stakeholders. There are several tools available, like stakeholder maps, stakeholder influence matrices, stakeholder registers. However, majority of these tools are rarely used beyond initial scoping phase. So there are several techniques that you can use to continuously use in terms of stakeholder management. First, you need to differentiate between motives and expectations. As easy as it sounds, can be extremely challenging. You cannot sometimes tell what motivates certain stakeholder, and it certainly can be different from their expectations. Motivation in many people can be anything close to opposing towards actual expectations they have from the project. So expectations are collected through face-to-face interviews. These are the most successful ways to do so. Using questionnaires, forms, basically collecting individual feedback any way possible. You can be quite open about discussions around expectations of the stakeholders, even though motives can be concealed. And there probably will be no discussions around actual motives of these particular stakeholders of their interest in the project. That said, you still need to be able to identify motives, and this skill you cannot learn by books. Since the motives are the real drivers behind the way stakeholders think, act, and behave, you need to know what motivates each stakeholder, and quite often you cannot get it directly. So expectations, they are just expressions of the intent captured at the project start. And they usually don't change during the course of the project, although it can happen. There are changes to the course of the stakeholder, or change of position of the stakeholder. But it's still extremely difficult to distinguish between motives and expectations. And many project managers and project teams use extremely formal way of capturing expectations, since most project managers think of expectations as the only needed information for the project, while motives being murky, they just discard or don't think it's useful. It is still necessary to have a holistic, comprehensive picture about the motives of the stakeholders engaged with the project, and you cannot get this information without actually asking a direct question and getting a direct answer. So there are pretty much the only means left are indirect and informal ways of ascertaining the information around stakeholder motives. Each project manager needs to learn to carefully study what key stakeholders say and do in natural line of function, and making correlation between the words and the deeds can reveal true motive. Not necessarily so, but can help. And it can show you if a motive is different from the expectation of the stakeholder. The more political the project, the higher need for such information is for the project manager. For instance, an example, a stakeholder can be very supportive in words of the project goals, but will do nothing to assist the project goals, basically not helping project manager and the project to reach the goals, despite what particular stakeholder might be saying. that would be a clear signal that there is ulterior motive for this particular stakeholder. So careful observation is crucial in this. Not often project managers have access to ability to do observations or even time to do observations, but it's something that any PM should strive towards. So you cannot treat all stakeholders equally. Otherwise, you will make project suffer and potentially fail. You need to treat each stakeholder differently based on their nature, the circumstances, ways you need to work with them. So it's a skill, it's a fine line that you need to traverse. There are situations where you need to actually put hardline stance against certain stakeholders. So you might have a full range of engagements with stakeholders, anywhere from non-communication, from agreeable engagements down to being openly hostile or extremely formal way of talking to certain stakeholders. So this needs to be carefully managed. You cannot treat every stakeholder equally. It's impossible to essentially to keep all stakeholders engaged, aligned, and happy at the same time during the progress of the project. The more complex the project, the more difficult it is to manage stakeholders. So in such cases, it might make sense to form alliances with certain groups of stakeholders, and you need to be able to identify groups of such stakeholders. We talked about this in previous PM sessions, but need to emphasize this one more time. Stakeholders can have groups that can be treated somewhat uniformly, and during the course of a project, you might need to have the need to form alliances with certain groups of the stakeholders based on what benefits the project more. Essentially, picking the right fights, dealing with the people that not just seem valuable for the project, but are valuable for the project, is the key thing for project manager. Yet it's extremely fine art and takes time to make excellent skill out of this, and it's not easy to learn using just the books. So in complex projects, there are always going to be occasions where the project team is tempted to engage in certain conflict with a certain side if it's needed for the success of the project, and it's totally fine actually. Project is a change, and change creates conflict. There is no project without conflict. However, you need to make sure that you don't pick too many fights. You need to be careful in creating conflict or being a part of a conflict so it doesn't overwhelm the overall project delivery by straining your resources, time, and basically morale of the project team. So project manager needs to be able to identify, basically to list and identify only the key battles during the course of the project. And in order to avoid fighting unnecessary battles, the project manager should be able to define acceptable levels of behavior for each stakeholder or stakeholder group. And if stakeholder, let's say, remains within the defined acceptable level of behavior, then possible project team shouldn't waste time dealing with this stakeholder behavior. However, if defined behavioral limits are exceeded, then possibly project manager and the project team need to be engaged in active countermeasures to the particular stakeholder's behavior. So part of the project, any project, is power and influence of any particular site, any particular stakeholder. And remember, project manager is stakeholder just like any other in the project. Therefore, each stakeholder has own power level, own influence level, and careful management of all the powers and influences is what makes the project. And the project manager relies on their own power and influence to deliver the project and to achieve the project goals. Main issues when dealing with organizational politics is conflict, and conflict is natural to project to change. However, politics and conflict is a very hard thing to manage, and organizational politics is no different from any other politics in general. Therefore, it can create huge problems where you pick a fight that you can't win. There are different influences of the organizational politics in projects, and it can have both positive and negative impact, such as siding with a stakeholder group that views the project manager favorably, just due to nature of the particular project manager, to provide more resources and more visibility for the project itself. And it can likewise have negative impact regardless of the actual project needs. Different organizational units can have ulterior motives, as we mentioned, that would not be visible in general expectations, definitions when planning the project and when scoping the project, and all throughout the execution and delivery of the project. So careful identifying positive and negative impacts of the politics on the project should be part of your risk management strategy. You need to be aware of all the political structures in the organization. Any big enough group of people creates political structures, and businesses are no different. The bigger the organization, the bigger the political structures in it. So knowing the culture of the company, knowing the political structure of the company is evident feature of a successful project manager. And as a part power projection, you need to know about the formal power and informal power. And to remind, formal power is vested by authority from the management of the project manager, let's say, vested in terms of formal job position description and the features of this position, while the informal power is happening on a human level in terms of projecting your expertise, your confidence, and ability to lead. Projects are impacted differently by the organizational politics, and intensity of the political engagement in any particular project can be quite different. Some projects might have zero impact of the organizational politics and probably have the project manager on such project might have no need to deal with the company politics. Others are extremely political and extremely delicate when delivering. Why is it so? It all comes again down to the motives of any particular stakeholder. Some projects, for instance, don't create any impact on any particular stakeholder or don't create any conflict with the motive of any particular stakeholder. Therefore, there are no negatively impacting motives from the stakeholder list of the project. The other projects that are extremely delicate and very much colored politically, they will be as such specifically due to high impact of project progress, project success, and project goals on the motives of some or all stakeholders. So keeping an eye on this is very important. When dealing with projects that are potentially extremely political, project manager needs to know that scoping and planning a project and delivering the project as well requires defining your strategies and dotting the line from strategies to the project goals, project results, using your power, your influence, and political skills. And here, that's where any project manager needs to become sort of a politician, being able to seek, acquire, and manage the power of yourself, of your position. And this is very generalized, of course, and I won't deal into specific details. It will take hours and hours of discussions. But key steps to dealing with the power, political power, is understanding the stakeholder landscape, who you have in your stakeholder list. Who do you deal with? What are the groups? Know the power holders, the key stakeholders, those that impact your project the most, or those that without whose engagement your project will not succeed. Building political capital is essentially building alliances and getting out so that all the parties know you, know your position, and know that they can work with you. Identifying a kind of political operator that you are is also important. And here you can use just standard way of break it down your approach, like a matrix approach. You can be, let's say, agreeable and and not hardline at all on one side of the spectrum, and extremely disagreeable and hardline on the other side of the spectrum. And anywhere in between is basically who you are as a political operator. And one key element of the politics is you have to be consistent. However, as a political operator, you also must be flexible enough to deal with different types of stakeholders. That's what politics is, and you need to be quite skilled in being able to operate. There are two sides to the power. As I mentioned, there is formal power and there is informal power. Formal power is the one vested to you with the authority of your managers, of your direct boss and your job position. And informal power is what you get in a sense of projecting your expertise, your ability to work with other people, to negotiate with other people, and overall your reputation. So, more specifically, the simplest form of direct formal authority is the one vested in a position, in your position. And there are several ways this type of power can be exerted, especially motivating people if you're positioned as their manager. And in a society, and any organization is not an exemption from that, formal power can lead to abuse of the power. So it might sound a bit ridiculous from the business perspective, but project manager needs to be careful not abusing the formal power. It's much better to apply informal power when you see that abuse of your formal power is possible. Better is to control certain resources that everybody needs. For instance, you have control over employee distribution, budgets, and assets. And that type of authority gives you control of the people interested in these particular resources. Again, this should not lead to abuse. Use of rules, regulations, and organizational structure is important way of projecting the power. If you know hierarchies, how these structures work with each other, it will help you in actually projecting your power to correct people and actually exercise your power by knowing who to work with. Controlling the decision process, equally important power element. Not always you have a formal way of impacting decision making, so you can apply both formal and informal way of controlling the decision process. For instance, decisions made in committees or meetings can be influenced if you have a good political stance with the committee and the members of any set particular committee. Controlling the knowledge and information is equally important, and this is more informal power in a way. If you know more, you can make better educated decisions and make moves that will be beneficial to you if certain parties have less knowledge than you are. Again, there is a risk of abuse, therefore we need to be careful. And that's why you need to make sure to control your boundaries. You shouldn't exceed your boundaries and possibly engage other stakeholders helping with activities outside of your boundaries, such as, for instance, working with business units that are not your subordinates, but you, for instance, require certain work to be done by these business units, and basically collaborating with the managers of these units is the way for you to deal with delivery on such tasks. And finally, just like anything in project management, power projection can be very much uncertain. And this goes not only for the project manager, but also for any stakeholder, and creates tension for people by not knowing what are your activities, what are your goals. And it can be normal. However, you need to be able to identify stakeholders that are key to your project and make sure that they understand your line of thinking and your plans to the extent beneficial for the project. Advantages of informal power are coming basically not from your official position, to reiterate, but from respect and appreciation that you've earned with other stakeholders, either be it separate members of a certain group or a group of stakeholders. And it helps you in emerging as a leader. Having a leadership outlook for stakeholders is very beneficial for project manager, as people will turn to you whenever there's a certain need coming. Through your position of leadership, you can influence informal leadership. You can influence the behavior of other stakeholders. And again, need to be careful of not abusing your power in this essence. And maintaining positive relationships is a huge advantage of your informal power when projected. That means basically you can impact your project success by getting more from other stakeholders if you, as compared to the situation where you wouldn't have a good positive relationship with certain stakeholders. And there are standard sources of power, and in fact, you can actually use standard listing. There are, again, formal authority. There are control of scarce resources, as I mentioned. You can use organizational structure, rules, and regulations to your advantage as a source of power. You can be in control of decision process, both using formal and informal power. Control of the knowledge and information, as I mentioned, is extremely powerful tool. You can use it to your advantage. Making sure that you control the boundaries and don't exceed your boundaries, and not letting the others exceed their boundaries is balance of power. Ability to cope with uncertainty in the sense that not only the project manager, as a project manager dealing with the uncertainty, but also helping the key stakeholders deal with their uncertainty by being predictable or clear for the key stakeholders. And one last point is control of technology. Any of project delivery can benefit from technology, and if you have technological resources, then you have your benefit of the employed technology over stakeholders that might use this technology for their benefit in the project, as opposed to your benefit, more specifically project success benefit. So there are two characteristics of power. Let me talk a bit more about this. So there is authority distinction and influence distinction. So the person who possesses power has ability to manipulate or influence others. And therefore, authority legitimizes this as a source of power in the organization. And it doesn't mean that power needs to be legitimate. As we mentioned, there can be formal and informal power. So you can make basically a distinction between classical bureaucratic authority and acceptance theory of authority. On the opposite spectrum, the acceptance theory talks about authority as a character of communication in a formal organization by virtue of which it is accepted by a member of organization as governing the action that this member contributes to. So power in this sense means your position as a project manager and your control over actions and resources that you contribute to. As influence goes, influence is much broader than power itself. It's a process of affecting potential behavior of others. And power is just the capacity of the influence. So authority is different from power because of legitimacy and acceptance of the authority, and more so influence, through which is broader than power. So both terms can be used interchangeably, but in general, authority is full capacity of the power rather than just power itself. So what are the outcomes of power projection? You can increase your own power level by applying methodical steps, and we talked about this in previous slides. You should definitely focus on positive impact, and this all should be part of risk management approach, which we discussed in previous PM sessions, and dealing with the risks of negative impact. Basically, it's important to identify all the impacts of the power projection, and both coming from you and from other stakeholders, and identify which have positive impact on the project and which have negative impact on the project. Your own power level is equally important for identification. You must know what are your what are your formal power, what is your formal power given to, and what is your informal power, and you must be honest about this. In many cases, you might actually seek help in identifying your power level from impartial third party by just having a conversation. And it's not easy to evaluate your own power level, but it's something that's very important for success of dealing with the organizational politics and overall having success in your project. Developing strategies to increase your total power is basically something that you need to do to pursue both formal power and informal power success. For instance, in formal power, you might seek accepting formally a wider range of responsibilities and influence over the organization through actual job position changes. And informally, you can increase your total power by enhancing your people skills, creating positive links with stakeholders in your project and overall organizations within your business. All of this requires fine understanding of the politics in the organization and in a particular project. So going back to project management issues and overall project issues, there are several questions that come to mind. Why do we have organizational politics? Why do we even need it? This can help, just asking this question can help in dealing with the overall political climate, delivering the projects. Organizations cannot function without certain rules. And rules can be formal and informal. If you have formal rules, that's part of the organizational politics, but sometimes it's not even the biggest one. Any human organizations have lots of informal rules, and that's where organizational politics comes to play. Basically, it's based on every individual beliefs, ulterior motives, and their expectations. So a combination of all of these can have a huge impact on the overall organizational politics. And this creates organizational and management issues in the sense that you need to navigate and be aware of such political rules. You need to know what are the political groups in your company. And this might sound like any government politics, but company politics is no different in the core. And by knowing organizational politics, you can deal with management of the project, of the team more efficiently, and avoid failures where you would be impacted otherwise if you wouldn't know the actual political climate. And this creates issues essentially if you're not aware of or you cannot find out about current political climate. What are the groups, stakeholder groups, what are the individual stakeholder motives? You cannot make educated management decisions. In addition to that, there are external factors that impact company politics and project management, such as global market situation or some external parties that impact company decisions, which in the end trickles down to impact on the project level. And just taking the example of the current world situation, the supply chain issues in the world, if you have certain structure previously that suddenly changes to the extreme, where significant parts of the supply chains are just severed, it creates external strain on the internal company politics, might impact motives and expectations of the stakeholders within the company. And in the end, project manager needs to be aware of such situations and plan in advance to avoid failing in delivering the project goals. People are essentially what makes any organization, and people behave differently. As we talked before on a previous session, people management skills are crucial, because any project is essentially an endeavor that you engage with other people. Every stakeholder is a person or a group of people. And people influence organizational politics, they impact your project, and organizational politics impacts both people and your project. So being aware of current state of the political climate in your organization is crucial if you want to have a successful project. It sounds like an overkill in some situations, and it is. Some projects don't benefit or get affected too much by the company politics, but at some point you'll come across a much more complex project that will be heavily impacted by company politics, and you need to make sure that you know the people, you know the political sides in your organization, and you take that into account while doing project scoping, while doing project planning, and especially when executing the project. So there are two types of politics. Basically, you need to make sure to analyze the political landscape. And essentially, the types of politics can be both negative and positive. And it all depends on political viewpoints of the people that make this political organizational politics and the political landscape. There are positions, so-called naives, the position sharks, and political sensible. And you might guess that it basically has a spectrum of positions. Naives are basically idealistic people that believe in everybody collaborating on their goodwill. The sharks that basically reap the benefits regardless of the positions of other people by executing the policies that benefits themselves without regard for anybody else. and political sensible side that tries to find a balance between these two poles. And in general, a project manager should be politically sensible. Basically, you cannot influence viewpoints and intentions of and political positions of others directly, but you can try and find balance between political positions of the key stakeholders, and remember, only the key stakeholders of the project, by basically being sensible and understanding of the motives of every group or person, political spectrum of your organization. And here we can also break down into categories, the stakeholders into categories. These are very common, general in business. You have your customers that have a product value or service value and quality as a stake. You have employees, including your project team, that value the most income and employment safety, basically being protected and rely on the fact that they can continue working. You can have your investors into the organization that would have financial returns as a stake. Suppliers and vendors have a stake in the revenue when dealing with the organization, and contractual safety basically guarantees that the revenues will continue. Communities and many companies, communities will be impacted, especially if it's a industrial business, from perspective of health, public safety, and economic development of a particular region. So these communities will be very interested in a particular project that impacts the said community. And the governments. Government regulates market, regulates business, and receives benefit from particular business in sense of taxes, which impacts overall global domestic product, the GDP. Now, an entirely different topic. You have your different sides of the spectrum on the political scene within your organization. How do you convert adversaries and opponents into allies? How do you convert opponents into your allies? And here it's important to remember that one voice is not going to work. You must create a course. You must basically let other stakeholders know your position and onboard them on your cause to voice it to a particular opponent. So you need to create a choir. Look for common denominator when observing your opponents. Try to find a position that will benefit both. Try to avoid emotions, passion when building a relationship with your opponent. Preferably, you should start with issues that you believe in without any passion, dispassionately. And essentially sticking to the facts is easier than trying to work with your opponent from emotional point of view. In order to demonstrate your opponent your intentions, you need to show that you're serious, that you stick to your promises, that you deliver on what you promise. Sharing the needed information where it needs to be shared, such as, let's say, project audits, if your opponent can benefit from that. And in the end, anything that benefits your opponent and doesn't detract from success of your project can be used to incline your opponent to become more agreeable with you and potentially to become an ally. Being credible means building trust. The more credibility you have, the more influence you have. And the greater your influence, the more you can get done. So it's basically a very dynamic process. And the base of it is trust. So everything you do must be taken seriously, and being taken seriously builds trust. And it doesn't get easier. It is a hard work. You need to continue with the same level of performance as a project manager, as a part of political culture, political environment of your company. And don't expect that it will be easier. If it gets easier, then just a pleasant situation. But if it doesn't get easier, you'll be ready. It's a hard work. So let's talk a little bit about acquiring and exercising power, according to Professor John Hayes, who is an expert in social psychology and change management. The big idea is that managers need to be able to identify stakeholders that can affect the outcome of a given project or a process, basically identifying key stakeholders. This can be done to correctly assess and determine how the manager should handle the positive and negative attitudes with regards to the project. Moreover, managers need to comprehend and deal with the politics of different organizations and understand that companies and other institutions becoming more complex and more pluralistic. And from perspective of John Hayes, any organization is a political arena where individuals and groups will try to obtain their self-oriented goals, their basically benefit themselves, and work in accordance to their motives, not their declared positions. So there are really 5 factors from position of Professor John Hayes that explain the theory of acquiring and exercising power and influence. Promoting reputation is the first factor. And basically, it's a factor of promoting the reputation of the manager. Stakeholders will be more likely to accept and follow a manager when this particular manager is perceived to be competent and delivers on the desired benefits that basically outcomes that benefit particular stakeholders. This means the manager not only needs the right competencies, but also need to be seen as a competent manager. That's where the political view comes into play. The people will pay more attention to managers whom they perceive as competent, motivated, and have the ability to affect the outcomes. Increasing the dependency of the manager, basically the others should depend on the manager more. And it's the manager's ability to influence targeted stakeholders by increasing their dependencies on the project manager, or generally the manager. And the manager can assess dependence by understanding what stakeholders seek from the manager, such as information, resources, contacts, etc. Consider how these recourses are important to the stakeholders, and investigate how easily the stakeholders can obtain the mentioned information or resources from the others, if they can. In parallel, the manager should minimize the dependence on the other stakeholders. This can be done by looking at the identification of alternative sources of given assets that you require. Test existing agreements from both internal and external side, where manager sees stakeholders exercising power on them, and challenge these current dependency relationships to benefit the project manager. On the other side, you can focus on building collaborative relationships rather than projecting your power from the perspective of dependencies. Building collaborative relationships should improve managers' ability to influence other stakeholders, as the relationships should support the agenda from the manager. Close relationships give the manager the opportunity to identify resources and information that others may need, and they currently, for instance, don't have. And this creates new possible dependencies in favor of the manager to provide. Projects can have problems with limited resources, not just because they need more, but of the handling of the existing resources. For instance, not knowing that they are needed. And improving communication here, facilitated by the manager, should improve the situation. Improved relationships can also give a possibility for others using new collaborative networks to impact third parties that otherwise would be unreachable for the management. And finally, negotiating negotiating beneficial agreements. It is stated by the Professor Hayes that most agreements are based on the level of interdependence. Managers who are good at exercising power and influence on stakeholders should be able to realistically determine what the project or the company can do for the stakeholder and vice versa. This can lay a good ground for agreements. So when handling stakeholders, these factors are of the greatest importance. And, being efficient in them helps. Using stakeholder mapping, you can actually approach in identifying the stakeholders in the order of importance, impact, and basically benefit for the project. It doesn't mean that some stakeholders, if they're not impactful enough, should be just dropped from the list of stakeholders. So first step, as we mentioned in previous sessions, is stakeholder identification. This is started during project scoping. You build your stakeholder register. You conduct interviews work with other identified stakeholders to identify additional stakeholders just by listing out the contacts. Then you need to perform impact and support analysis of stakeholders identified, and keep in mind you continue stakeholder identification throughout the project, because you don't know when the stakeholder environment can change. So you evaluate stakeholder from the perspective of project impact and project benefits, in the sense what does project get from this particular stakeholder, as well as identifying the needs and potential motives of each stakeholder. And then once you have all the stakeholders identified, to the best of your knowledge, of course, you need to identify the key stakeholders, basically without whose engagement you won't be able to reach the project goals. There are several limitations to this approach. First is the context. The position of different stakeholders in power interest matrices can vary greatly depending on the situation and the task at hand. Therefore, it's important to understand the context in which the analysis is performed, and possibly have alternative power and interest matrix for different situations. Understanding of the impact of any particular stakeholder, the power of any particular stakeholder, basically you should be able to evaluate every stakeholder from power perspective in mentioned matrix of the power and interest, in the sense how it impacts the organization and the project itself. And the manager needs to consider in which political environment they're operating in regards to how it impacts the stakeholders. This theoretical approach has also a research background in the sense that it's built upon experience of Professor John Hayes. And Professor John Hayes, over decades, built a huge body of knowledge working with big industries that provided enough data to define this approach. And this was done with the help of a lot of product development teams within these big companies, including automotive and aerospace industries. So, in a sense, this was tested out on hundreds of thousands of people in different countries, different industries, and were proven to be correct. And the status quo of this particular theory is that you can basically combine two areas of the greatest relevance and apply theory of stakeholder identification, assessment, and management as part of your project management standards. And combining them into area of power assessment, power acquisition, and power management will extend your knowledge and practical approaches for stakeholder management. So let's talk a bit about stakeholder management policies. Stakeholder management policies is basically can be a document that you define for overall stakeholder management. There are several approaches that you can employ here and to draft such a document. First of all, you need to identify what is the regulatory framework that you use within your organization. Maybe you have some laws that impact work with your stakeholders and the work within the company. There could be some company policies. You need to have them documented and identified from the perspective of stakeholder management. Going back to the stakeholder identification, you need to perform stakeholder mapping. It's crucial to the successful stakeholder engagement, and as well as effective allocation of the resources and time of the project manager. You need to identify stakeholder interests, capture key internal and external issues of any particular stakeholder, as well as concerns, capture stakeholder expertise on certain material issues, capture stakeholder level of influence, and you can measure it any way you want. It's basically a comparative of value to other stakeholders. Capture stakeholder expectations, and if possible, stakeholder motives. If this is what we started with this session, the motives are important. And in the end, what is the value for the project to engage with this particular stakeholder? Likewise, you need to keep in mind stakeholder engagement risks. And this should be both part of the stakeholder management and risk management plans that project manager defines. Some stakeholders can create inter-stakeholder conflicts or have possibly benefits that you need to reap. So you need to keep associated risks with any particular stakeholders documented. If possible, you should ascertain effectiveness of each engagement. You need to evaluate the outcome of each stakeholder engagement. You can do it on a regular basis, or if needed, just on the planning stage, depending on the nature of the project. And evaluation should consider a wide range of the issues. For instance, whether the organization and the stakeholder were aware of each other's interests and issues, and this was communicated and understood by both sides. Whether the relationship on interests and issues and the desired outcomes or personalities interfered with the engagements. Whether the objectives, scope, and the process of the engagement was clearly stated and executed, and what could be improved in future engagement activities. So this should be captured. As a stakeholder engagement manager, every member of your team need to be aware of engagement policies, and it should be done in a coordinated manner through sharing of management policies document with all the members of the project team. Policy communication must be supported by the project team and all the associated structures within our organization, possibly through dedicated channels, if defined as such by project manager or greater team. But administration, communication, and review of the policies should be done in a coherent and cohesive way. We must have a central way of storing these policies, sharing with appropriate stakeholders and project team members, and having understanding of consistent delivery on these policies. That is about it. There are a lot of things to cover indeed in stakeholder deep dive and working with organizational politics. But keep in mind that successful project means there's a successful project manager who is competent at navigating the political environment of any particular organization and working successfully with stakeholders of the mentioned project. We'll talk more about this in other sessions, but for the time being, this is the core of what I wanted to share. Thank you all for coming.